There might have been a connection between Oscar Schneider coming to the United States and my father. My real father, as Edward Cameron. My father was Alexander Duncan Cameron Sr., who was involved in government intelligence from the time he left the Navy in 1929 through the period of 46 when he was heavily involved in Operation Paperclip. He brought a lot of German scientists into the U.S. I certainly don't know who they all were. Could he possibly have had a connection with Oscar Schneider? So I think it's possible.
After World War II, the underground base at Nordhausen was rebuilt in the Mojave Desert, a place we now know as Area 51.
Okay, so in your conversations with Phil, did he say anything else about this, his dad and the Philadelphia experiment specifically to you? Did he say?
The only other things that came out specifically was that Phil's father and my father were very close friends.
Okay.
And they used to go on fishing trips together out of Sarasota, Florida. This was, of course, after the war was over. But I can make an assumption here without really knowing the facts that they might have known each other before Oscar Schneider came to the U.S. That is a possibility.
Okay. So that was the link, I guess. That was the reason why Phil Schneider came to you in the first place.
He came to me in the first place because he knew that I was involved in the Philadelphia experiment. He knew his father was involved
and he wanted to close the
and he wanted to tell me about it and
Okay.
discuss various things.
So from that point, did you two become close friends?
Yes, we did.
Immediately?
We became casual friends at first. And as time went on, I kept talking with him. I says, Phil, with what you know about various things in the background, plus the Philadelphia experiment and what you say you had been involved with in building underground bases and traveling in the underground and building the underground tube transportation system, why aren't you out talking about this publicly? He says, you're not involved in the Navy anymore. You're not in the service. You're not working for the government.
So was he retired at the time?
He was retired. He actually was retired in the sense that he retired himself. He was not formally retired. He walked out on the government. He walked out on the NATO position. And the reasons for that he gave me very specifically. And in terms of the background of Phil, this might prove very interesting. Phil, in his own way, worked his way up through the ranks as a geologist and became involved with building underground bases and the tube system for the underground transportation system, and eventually graduated into a NATO position. It was all over the world, and he knew how many underground bases were built in the U.S. as well as worldwide. He used to tell me 131 in the U.S. and about 1,400 worldwide, of the type we described, which was 1 to 3 miles underground, anywhere from 1/2 to 3 cubic miles of earth were removed by nuclear detonation, and to create this huge cavern, because the rock is porous, and if you choose the right earth materials, the right rock material, which he was an expert at, you had to use certain types of rock material to build the underground base, or you just forgot it. It had to be certain layered rocks, certain structures, which I am not familiar with, but he was. And you would build these underground bases. They were all over the world. They've been built by other nations also. And part of this led into his NATO operations, but the thing where he left was most interesting. He was online for, and I said 2.5, 3 years retirement for NATO, formal retirement, with his salary at that time in NATO had gone up to something like $500,000 a year. This is a salary.
Wow.
And his retirement was slated to be $1 million per year retirement. He was an extremely important person at a very high level, had high-level clearances. But he said what changed his mind, and he decided to walk out on everything, was the fact that he was invited to attend some UN meetings, the very classified ones, which were not held in New York at the UN terminal and the UN buildings, but in a deep underground military base. And they said there was a facility which had all of the layout exactly like they have in the UN headquarters in New York, underground in this base. He never told me where it was. But there was an extra row of chairs, or a ring table and a row of chairs, above the rest, which was not extant in the usual settings for the UN, for the meetings. Everybody would go in there, including spectators, were there himself and some other people. Everybody would sit down and be waiting, and then the final group came in, would sit at this upper tier of chairs. They were all tall grays, extraterrestrials, 7-footers.
Like the ones he shot in Dulce?
I don't know if he ever shot a 7-footer. He didn't tell me particularly whether it was a 7-footer or not, but he said the ones that came in on the UN meeting were the 7-footers, and they dictated policy to the United Nations. He attended not one but 2 meetings of this type, and he says after the second meeting, he says, I am working for the wrong people. Had a conference that day with some of his NATO friends in the NATO Department of Geology, I believe is what he called it. There's a whole group of about 40 of them. They all decided they wanted no more of any part of it. They walked out on retirement, salaries, everything. All 40 walked out the same day and wiped out the NATO's Department of Geology. And he retired. He went back to Portland, Oregon. He was living alone in his own apartment. I had an ex-wife and a daughter, about 8 years old, I met at that time. She's a little older than that now. And sort of ruminated within himself. Talked occasionally before one group in Oregon, which was the Western Bigfoot Society. I have photos of him talking before that, and there is one article published on the net about it. He used to talk about some of the things he knew at this Bigfoot Society group, but he never went totally public. This was a private group. It was not a really public group. I kept insisting, with what you know, Phil, you should go public with this. I said it's in the interest of the public. They should know some of these things. I said, I'm not telling you should say everything you know, but certainly about the underground bases and operations and so forth. So I finally got him out on the lecture circuit after we talked about this quite a bit. The first attempt at a lecture, which was successful so far as the lecture was concerned, but in terms of videotaping it was a failure, and that was on 7th of May 1995 in Las Vegas, Nevada.
Was that his first lecture?
That was the first one public of this nature.
Okay.
It's not the first lecture he ever did.
Yeah, because he mentions that he did like 30 or 40 lectures.
He did a total that year of about 30 or 40. He made some prior to that, again with the Bigfoot Society and the small groups in the Portland area. But this was in Las Vegas on 7th of May. The next day we were slated, the 8th of May, to talk up in the Coeur d'Alene area of Idaho.
So was it 94 that he decided to go public?
It was early 95. I kept twisting.
It was early 95.
I kept twisting his arm, and he finally decided, all right, we'll try it.
Yeah.
The first one that was recorded successfully was the one outside of Coeur d'Alene. I think it was Post Falls, Idaho.
Mm-hmm.
That was on the 8th of May. Then there was the August one in Denver at the Dean Stonier's conference, Global Sciences, and he did a workshop for about 2 hours. September, for the preparedness show in Seattle. November, another preparedness show in not Seattle, it was elsewhere. I think Denver. And that was the last of the public series which were recorded. In between this, of course, he had many other lectures. He knew a great deal about the Kobe, Japan earthquake, which is what it was formerly called.
Oh, and many others, too.
Yeah, but he knew a great deal about those. He knew a great deal about the earth faults. He used to tell me about them.
The earth falls?
Earth faults all over the U.S. He knew all about them. Faults, right. Yeah, the fault lines. And the Denver was relatively safe, but he said if you go west into some of these so-called secluded areas for survival, he says they've got fault lines running right through them. He says the first ridge of the Great Rocky Mountains, as an example, is loaded with fault lines. He says you don't want to be there. He says you go further west in the second ridge. He says you're okay. He knew all the geologic layouts and where the problems were and such. But he was invited to go to Japan to speak over there. The State Department refused to let him go. They says, you're not going. He says, we know you have a passport, but you're not going to Japan. We will not allow it.
Oh, because he wanted to talk about the Kobe earthquake.
He wanted to talk about the Kobe earthquake and a few other things.
And they wanted to find out, didn't they?
And they wanted to find out the facts of what he might know. Yeah. So they arranged that. Since he's now long gone, it doesn't make any difference. He arranged it very neatly. The Japanese says, we'll pick you up out of Vancouver, BC. He says, we'll fly our own jet over. He says, you drive up. He says, you can drive across the border with no problem. Of course you can, unless there was a strict order at the border that he's not to go, which there wasn't. He could just, as a tourist, drive across the border into Canada on a driver's license. He didn't have to show a passport. So he did that. And he met them at a particular airport in Vancouver area, and they flew him over to Japan in their private jet. He was there 3 days lecturing on the Kobe earthquake and who knows what else.
When you say they, who were the they?
They were the top executives of major Japanese corporations.
Uh-huh.
Mitsubishi is one example. I remember he mentioned Mitsubishi, and some of the others. I don't remember all the names.
So they must have given him quite a bit of credibility.
They did give him a great deal of credibility.